The whistle of a bullet cut through the warm Wyoming air just inches from Abram Tanner's left ear as he dove behind a rocky outcropping, dust clouding around him in the late afternoon sun of 1875. He wasn't supposed to die today, not when he'd finally gathered enough money to start fresh somewhere far from the unforgiving frontier that had been both his salvation and his curse. Pressing his back against the sun-warmed stone, Abram checked his revolver, 3 bullets left and 4 men still pursuing him. The odds weren't good, but they rarely had been in his 30 years of life. His weathered hat had fallen off during his desperate sprint for cover, leaving his dark hair exposed to the relentless western sun. "Tanner," a voice bellowed across the expanse, "hand over what you stole, and maybe we'll just break your legs instead of putting you in the ground." Abram gripped his revolver tighter, the leather of his gloves creaking. He hadn't stolen anything that wasn't rightfully his. The money from selling his late father's ranch was his inheritance, despite what his father's business partner claimed. But men like Harrington didn't care about truth, only power and possession. Another shot ricocheted off the rocks, sending fragments flying past his face. "I need to make it to Devil's Pass," he muttered to himself, knowing that once through the narrow mountain passage, he could disappear into the vast territory beyond. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made his heart race. They were trying to flank him. Abram took a deep breath, preparing to make a run for his horse tethered behind a cluster of trees just 50 yards away. "Lord help me," he whispered, then sprang from his hiding place. He'd made it halfway to his horse when a searing pain tore through his side. The impact sent him sprawling into the dirt, his vision blurring as he clutched at the wound. Warm blood seeped between his fingers as he dragged himself behind a fallen log. "Got him," a triumphant voice called out. "Flush him out, boys." Abram's consciousness began to fade, the blue Wyoming sky darkening at the edges. As his eyes started to close, he thought he heard another horse approaching faster, more desperate than the others. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was a pair of determined blue eyes framed by auburn hair. Prudence Jamison had not ridden 15 miles at breakneck speed to find a dead man. After spotting the group of riders pursuing a lone figure from her family's homestead on the ridge, something inside her had known she couldn't simply watch. Not again. Not after what happened to her brother. Now, kneeling beside the wounded stranger as bullets kicked up dirt around them, she made a split-second decision that would change both their lives forever. "Can you hear me?" she asked, pressing her handkerchief against his bleeding side. "I need you to get up. We have to move now." The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and hazy with pain. "Leave me," he managed to whisper. "They'll kill you too." Prudence ignored him, hooking her arms under his shoulders and somehow hauling him to his feet. At 24, she was stronger than most gave her credit for. Years of working her family's homestead had built strength in her slender frame. "My horse is just there," she said, half dragging him toward her mare. "I need you to help me. I cannot lift you alone." The sound of voices grew closer. With strength born of desperation, she managed to help the wounded man onto her horse before climbing up behind him. "Hold on," she commanded, wrapping one arm around his waist while taking the reins with the other. Then she dug her heels into her horse's flanks, and they bolted toward the cover of the trees. Bullets whizzed past them as Prudence urged her mare faster, following a narrow trail she knew would lead to a hidden ravine where they might lose their pursuers. The man slumped against her, his breathing labored, but his hands gripped the saddle horn with surprising strength. "Stay with me," she urged, her voice barely audible over the thundering hoofbeats. "Just stay with me." They rode hard for what felt like hours, Prudence taking paths less traveled, cutting through streams to hide their trail. Only when the sun began to set and she was certain they weren't being followed did she slow their pace, finally stopping at a small cabin nestled in a dense grove of pines. "This was my uncle's hunting cabin," she explained, though she wasn't sure if the man was conscious enough to hear her. "No one comes here anymore." With great effort, she helped him down from the horse and into the cabin, settling him on a narrow cot while she hurried to light a lamp. In its glow, she could finally see the man she'd risked her life to save. He was handsome despite the dirt and blood, with a strong jaw covered in dark stubble and features that spoke of hardship and resilience. His clothes were worn but of good quality, not the garb of an outlaw, but not a dandy either. A working man with pride. "Let me see that wound," she said, gently pulling away his blood-stained shirt. The bullet had torn through his side but appeared to have missed anything vital. Still, he'd lost a lot of blood, and infection was always a deadly risk on the frontier. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice raspy as his eyes finally seemed to focus on her face. "Prudence Jamison," she replied, reaching for her saddlebag to retrieve the small medical kit she always carried. "And you've lost a lot of blood, so I suggest you save your strength rather than asking questions." A faint smile touched his lips before pain twisted his features again. "Abram Tanner," he managed, "and you should have let me go." Prudence's hand stilled as she met his gaze. "And spend the rest of my life wondering," she countered softly. "I've done enough of that already." She worked in silence then, cleaning and bandaging his wound with practiced hands. Her father had been a doctor before he died, and she'd learned much from him during the years they'd spent treating the various injuries and ailments that befell their small community. "Those men," she said finally, "why were they after you?" Abram winced as she applied pressure to stop the last of the bleeding. "Money, what else? My father died 3 months ago. His business partner claimed the ranch belonged to him, despite the deed saying otherwise. When I sold it, he decided I'd stolen from him." His laugh was bitter. $6,000, my inheritance and my future. "And where is this money now?" Prudence asked, arching an eyebrow. His hand moved protectively to the inside pocket of his vest. "Safe, for now." "Well, Mr. Tanner, you need to rest. Those men are still out there, and we're not far enough away for comfort." She rose, wiping her bloodied hands on a cloth. "I'll tend to the horse and secure the cabin. You should sleep if you can." As she turned to leave, his hand caught her wrist. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through her despite the gravity of their situation. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You don't know me. I could be the villain in this story." Prudence carefully extracted her wrist from his grip. "I know what those men are capable of," she said quietly. "They've done this before. I watched them hunt down my brother 2 years ago for a crime he didn't commit. I was too far away to help then. Today I wasn't." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Rest, Mr. Tanner," she said, stepping away. "Morning will be here sooner than either of us would like." Outside the cabin, as she unsaddled her exhausted mare, Prudence finally allowed herself to contemplate the recklessness of her actions. She'd brought a wanted man to her family's secret cabin, risked her life, and for what? Because she couldn't stand by and watch another person hunted down like an animal. Or was it something in his eyes, a dignity and determination that reminded her so much of her lost brother that she couldn't look away? Whatever the reason, she was now as much a fugitive as he was. If Harrington's men found them, they wouldn't discriminate in their vengeance. She leaned her forehead against her mare's warm neck. "What have I done, Belle?" she whispered. The horse nickered softly in response, as if to say that sometimes the right decisions were also the most dangerous ones. Inside the cabin, Abram fought against the pain and exhaustion threatening to pull him under. His side burned like fire, but it was nothing compared to the tumult in his mind. Who was this woman who'd risked everything for a stranger? Her eyes held shadows of loss, yet burned with a fierce determination that he recognized from his own reflection. His hand moved once more to the inner pocket, where he kept the bank draft his ticket to a new life in California, away from the blood and dust of Wyoming territory. Now there was another life tangled with his, another person at risk because of him. Prudence, he whispered her name to the empty room, testing the feel of it on his tongue. A virtue he'd never much concerned himself with, yet now embodied in a woman who'd shown more courage than most men he'd known. As consciousness finally slipped away from him, one thought remained. He needed to leave as soon as possible. For her sake, if not his own. Morning came with painful brightness as sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window. Abram awoke to find himself alone, the scent of coffee hanging in the air. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his side. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Prudence's voice came from the doorway. She entered carrying a steaming cup and a plate of what looked like cornbread. "The bleeding has stopped, but you'll tear my stitches if you move too quickly." "Stitches?" he asked, gingerly touching his bandaged side. "You slept like the dead. I took the opportunity to properly close that wound." She set the food and coffee beside him. "Can you sit up if I help you?" With her assistance, Abram managed to prop himself against the wall, the simple movement leaving him light-headed and sweating. "You have a gentle touch for someone so." He trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence without offending her. "For a woman," she supplied, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. "My father was the doctor in Sweetwater Creek. I was his assistant from the time I could hold a needle steady." Abram took a sip of the coffee, grateful for its warmth and strength. "Is he worried about you? Your father?" A shadow passed over her face. "He died last winter, pneumonia. My mother passed when I was young and my brother." She didn't finish the sentence. "You're alone," he said softly, understanding dawning. "I have the homestead. Neighbors who look in on me. It's more than many have out here." She straightened, brushing dust from her simple brown skirt. "I rode out at first light to check for signs of Harrington's men. Nothing yet, but we can't stay here long. They know these mountains almost as well as I do." Abram studied her in the morning light. Without the frantic energy of the previous day, he could see her clearly now, auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, freckles dusting a sun-kissed face, and eyes the color of the summer sky. She wasn't conventionally beautiful in the way of the painted ladies in town saloons, but there was something striking in her self-possession, in the quiet confidence with which she moved. "You should go back," he said finally. "Tell anyone who asks that I forced you to help me." "They might believe that." Prudence regarded him with a steady gaze. "And what would you do? Crawl through the wilderness with a bullet wound? You wouldn't make it 5 miles. I've survived worse." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but you don't have to this time." She moved to the cabin's small window, peering out at the forested hillside. "We'll wait until tomorrow. Give you a chance to regain some strength. Then we'll move north, away from Sweetwater Creek. I know places where we can hide until you're well enough to travel properly." Abram set the cup down with more force than intended. "We? There is no we in this, Miss Jamison. You've done more than enough already." She turned to face him, arms crossed over her chest. "Do you have family somewhere, Mr. Tanner? Someone waiting for you?" The question caught him off guard. "No, not anymore." "Then let me be clear. I didn't risk my life yesterday to watch you die today from stubbornness. We'll travel together until you're healed, then you can go wherever you please with your $6,000. Her tone left no room for argument. Abram found himself smiling despite the pain and danger. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "Few people are, Mr. Tanner. Now eat your breakfast. We have a difficult journey ahead." The day passed slowly, with Prudence tending to Abram's wound and preparing for their departure. She was methodical, gathering supplies and planning their route with a precision that spoke of someone accustomed to self-reliance. By evening, Abram was able to stand and move carefully around the small cabin, though each step sent waves of pain through his side. He watched as Prudence counted out ammunition for the rifle she'd retrieved from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. "You handle that weapon like you know how to use it," he observed. "My brother taught me," she replied without looking up. After he came back from the war, he said a woman alone should know how to protect herself. Smart man. He was. She loaded the rifle with practiced movements, until Harrington's men accused him of stealing cattle. They didn't even give him a trial, just hunted him down like an animal. Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Abram moved closer, leaning against the table for support. "Is that why you helped me? Because of your brother?" Prudence finally looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. "Partly," she admitted. "But also because no one deserves to be judged and executed by men like Harrington. The law exists for a reason." "The law isn't always just," Abram said softly. "No," she agreed, "but it's all we have against chaos." She set the rifle aside. "We should sleep. Dawn comes early and we need to be gone before first light." They settled in for the night, Prudence taking a bedroll on the floor while insisting Abram keep the cot for his injury. Despite his protests, she was adamant, and he was too weak to argue effectively. As darkness filled the cabin, Abram found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of the woman lying just a few feet away. He'd spent years avoiding attachments, knowing that in his line of work, first as a bounty hunter, then as a ranch hand, connections only led to heartache. Yet in less than a day, Prudence Jamison had upended his carefully constructed solitude with her fierce independence and unexpected kindness. "Are you awake?" Her voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes," he answered. "Pain makes sleep difficult." He heard her shift, then the soft rustle of fabric as she sat up. "I have some willow bark in my bag. It might help." "I'll manage," he said. "Tell me about your homestead instead. What's waiting for you there?" In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he could just make out her silhouette as she pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. 20 acres of decent land. A small orchard my father planted when they first arrived. Chickens, 2 milk cows, and Belle. Her voice softened when she mentioned her horse. "It's not much, but it's mine, free and clear." "Sounds like paradise compared to most," Abram said, thinking of the years he'd spent with nothing but a bedroll and the clothes on his back. "It can be," she agreed, "but it's also lonely. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles away. In winter, sometimes weeks pass without seeing another soul." She paused. "What about you? What were you planning to do with your inheritance?" Abram stared up at the rough-hewn ceiling. "California," he said finally. "There's land there. Opportunities for a man to start fresh where no one knows his name or his past." "What's in your past that you're so eager to escape?" she asked. He hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "I was a bounty hunter before my father sent for me. Spent 5 years tracking men across territories, bringing them in dead or alive." The admission hung in the air between them. "It changes a man, that kind of work." "Is that how you knew how to evade Harrington's men?" "For all the good it did me," he said with a soft laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. Silence fell between them, comfortable despite the circumstances. Abram found himself wanting to know more about this woman, her dreams, her sorrows, the small details that made up a life so different from his own. "Why have you stayed?" he asked finally. "After your family was gone, why not sell the homestead and start somewhere new?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "It never occurred to me," she admitted. "That land is all I have left of them, of the life we built together." She paused. "Though lately I've wondered if memories are enough reason to stay somewhere." "And what did you decide?" "I hadn't," she said quietly. "Until yesterday." The implications of her words hung in the air between them, unacknowledged but impossible to ignore. Abram felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the guard he'd kept around his heart for so long. "We should sleep," he said eventually, unwilling to pursue the dangerous direction of his thoughts. "Tomorrow will test us both." "Yes," she agreed, lying back down on her bedroll. "Good night, Mr. Tanner." "Abram," he corrected gently. "After saving my life and sharing your floor, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." In the darkness, he couldn't see her smile, but he heard it in her voice when she replied, "Good night, Abram." "Good night, Prudence." They departed before dawn, Prudence helping Abram onto Belle's back before mounting behind him. His wound made riding painful, but he gritted his teeth against it, knowing their survival depended on putting distance between themselves and Harrington's men. "We'll head north through Widow's Canyon," Prudence explained as they set out. "It's treacherous terrain, but that works to our advantage. Not many know the safe paths through." The day's journey was grueling. They followed narrow trails that wound through dense forest and rocky passes, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the horse or for Prudence to check Abram's wound. By midday, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and he fought to remain upright as waves of dizziness threatened to overwhelm him. "Just a little further," Prudence encouraged, her arm steady around his waist. "There's a place ahead where we can rest properly." The place turned out to be a small cave hidden behind a waterfall, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, it was cool and dry, with evidence of previous use: a stone fire ring and a stack of firewood. "My brother and I found this when we were children," Prudence explained as she helped Abram settle against the cave wall. "It became our secret hideaway. No one else knows about it." As she busied herself making a small fire and preparing a meal from the supplies she'd packed, Abram watched her with growing admiration. She moved with purpose and efficiency, never wasting a motion or a word. "You would have made a fine scout in the war," he observed. She glanced up, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "Perhaps, though I prefer healing to fighting when given the choice. Yet here you are, on the run with a wounded stranger." "Life rarely gives us the choices we want," she replied, stirring a pot of beans she'd set over the small fire. "Only the ones we must make in the moment." They ate in companionable silence, the sound of the waterfall masking any conversation from potential eavesdroppers. Afterward, Prudence insisted on checking Abram's wound, her fingers gentle as they probed the tender flesh. "The stitches are holding," she pronounced. "No signs of infection yet, but you need rest. Real rest, not bouncing on horseback." "How long do you think we can stay here?" "A day, maybe two," she said, repacking her medical supplies. "Harrington's men will be searching the main trails first, but eventually they'll widen their search." Abram caught her hand as she withdrew it, holding it lightly in his own. "Why are you really doing this, Prudence?" "The truth." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "Because 2 years ago, I watched from a distance as my brother was hunted down. I was too afraid to help him then. I swore I would never let fear stop me from doing what's right again." She paused, something vulnerable flickering across her face. "And because when I saw you fighting for your life, something inside me recognized something in you." "What?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who, like me, has been alone too long." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Abram felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. Before he could respond, Prudence gently pulled her hand away. "You should rest," she said, rising to her feet. "I'll keep watch." That night, as Abram drifted between sleep and wakefulness, he found his thoughts continually returning to Prudence. In the dancing shadows cast by the dying fire, he watched her silhouette as she sat near the cave entrance, rifle across her lap, vigilant even in the deepest hours of the night. He'd known brave men in his time, soldiers, lawmen, fighters of all stripes. But there was something about her quiet courage that struck him more profoundly than any battlefield heroics. She had chosen this path not out of duty or necessity, but from a moral conviction that refused to be silenced. For the first time in years, Abram Tanner found himself imagining a future that wasn't solitary, one that included someone by his side who understood both the darkness and the light within him. It was a dangerous thought, more perilous than any bullet wound. And yet, as sleep finally claimed him, he welcomed it like an old friend returning after a long absence. They remained in the cave for 2 days, Abram growing stronger while Prudence ventured out occasionally to scout the surrounding area and replenish their water. On the morning of the 3rd day, as they prepared to continue their journey, the sound of approaching horses froze them both in place. "Get back," Prudence whispered urgently, dousing their small fire with water from the canteen. "All the way to the rear of the cave." Abram drew his revolver, checking that it was fully loaded. "Take this," he said, holding it out to her. "The rifle will be too unwieldy in here." She shook her head. "Keep it. You're the better shot with a handgun." Before he could argue, voices became audible over the sound of the waterfall men calling to each other as they dismounted nearby. "Search the area," a gruff voice commanded. "They can't have gone far with him wounded." Prudence and Abram exchanged glances in the dim light filtering through the waterfall. They were trapped, with nowhere to run and little chance of fighting their way past multiple armed men. "If they find us," Abram whispered, "I'll create a distraction. You run. Get to your homestead and tell everyone I kidnapped you." Her eyes flashed with anger. "I am not leaving you to die. And I'm not letting you die because of me," he countered fiercely. Footsteps approached the waterfall, and a shadow passed across the curtain of water. Both of them held their breath, pressing back against the cold stone wall. "Anything over there, Jenkins?" the gruff voice called. "Nah, just the waterfall, no tracks leading to it." Prudence closed her eyes briefly in relief. The recent rain had washed away any signs of their passage, and the cave entrance was concealed enough that casual observation wouldn't reveal it. "Mount up then," the leader ordered. "We'll try the North Ridge. If they're heading for the territorial border, that's their most likely route." They listened as the sounds of horses and men gradually faded into the distance, neither speaking until silence had reigned for several minutes. "That was too close," Prudence finally said, her voice unsteady. Abram reached for her hand in the dimness, finding it cold and trembling slightly. "You saved us both," he said softly. "Again." She shook her head. "Luck saved us. They'll be back, and next time we might not have warning." "Then we need to change our plans," Abram said, forcing himself to think strategically despite the pain still radiating from his wound. "They're expecting us to head north toward the territorial border. So we go east instead," Prudence finished his thought. "Toward Sweetwater Creek. It's risky," he acknowledged. "That's Harrington's territory, which is why it might work. They won't expect us to head straight for danger." Her eyes met his in the dim light. "There's an abandoned mine about 10 miles east of here. We could shelter there while deciding our next move." Abram nodded slowly. "It's our best option." He paused, studying her face. "But Prudence, if this goes wrong—" "It won't," she said with a conviction that brooked no argument. "Now help me pack our things. We should move while we still have daylight." The journey to the abandoned mine was tense, with both of them scanning the horizon constantly for signs of pursuit. They avoided trails, instead picking their way through dense underbrush and across rocky terrain where they would leave minimal tracks. By late afternoon, they reached the mine, a dark opening in the hillside, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the darkness absolute beyond the reach of daylight. "We'll need light," Prudence said, reaching into her saddlebag for the small lantern she'd packed. Once lit, it cast a warm glow that revealed a tunnel extending deeper into the mountain, the remnants of an operation abandoned years earlier. "How far does it go?" Abram asked, eyeing the timber supports that lined the walls with skepticism. "Not far," Prudence assured him. "Maybe 50 yards before it ends in a chamber where the miners used to store equipment. My father treated one of the workers after a cave-in. That's how I know about it." They led Belle inside, settling in the small chamber Prudence had described. Old crates and rusted tools littered the space, providing them with makeshift seating as they shared a meager dinner of jerky and hardtack. "How's your side?" Prudence asked, noticing how Abram winced when he shifted position. "Healing," he replied. "Thanks to your care." She moved closer, setting the lantern beside them. "Let me check it. We've been riding all day." He didn't argue, simply unbuttoned his shirt to allow her access to the bandages. Her touch was gentle as she unwound them, her face serious in concentration. The wound looked better than it had days earlier, still angry and red, but no longer weeping blood or showing signs of infection. "You're lucky," she murmured, applying a fresh salve from her medical kit. "An inch to the right and that bullet would have hit your liver." "I'm beginning to think luck has nothing to do with it," he said quietly, watching her face in the lantern light. "More like I had a guardian angel watching over me." She glanced up, her hands pausing in their work. "I'm no angel, Abram." "Maybe not," he conceded. "But you're something I haven't encountered much in this life, a genuinely good person." Her cheeks colored slightly at the compliment, and she quickly returned her attention to bandaging his wound. "There are plenty of good people in the world. Sometimes they're just hard to see through all the bad ones." "Is that why you stay on your homestead alone, waiting for the good ones to reveal themselves?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She secured the bandage and sat back, her eyes meeting his with a directness that had become familiar. "I stay because it's what I know," she said finally. "Because starting over somewhere else is terrifying. Because being alone is safer than risking disappointment." She paused. "At least that's what I've told myself." "And now," he prompted. Prudence looked away, her gaze falling on the lantern's flame. "Now I'm not so sure anymore." She stood abruptly. "We should get some sleep. I'll take first watch." Abram wanted to press further, to explore the current that seemed to flow between them whenever their guards dropped, but he recognized her retreat for what it was, a necessary protection of her heart. He'd done the same countless times. "Wake me in 4 hours," he said instead, settling back against a crate. "And Prudence," she paused, looking back at him questioningly, "thank you for everything." She nodded once, a small smile touching her lips before she moved to sit near the mine entrance, rifle across her lap in what had become a familiar pose of vigilance. As Abram drifted toward sleep, he found himself wondering what might happen when this danger passed, when they no longer needed to run together. The thought of returning to his solitary path suddenly seemed hollow, lacking the purpose it had held just days earlier. California was still waiting, but for the first time, he wondered if he might be heading there alone. The days in the abandoned mine blended together as they waited for Abram's strength to return fully and for the search to move elsewhere. They developed a rhythm, taking turns standing watch, sharing quiet meals, and talking in the hours when sleep eluded them both. It was during these conversations that Abram began to truly know Prudence, not just as the brave woman who'd saved his life, but as someone with dreams and fears of her own. She told him about growing up on the frontier, about her father's dedication to healing, about her mother's love of poetry that had seemed so at odds with the harshness of their surroundings. In turn, he shared parts of himself he'd kept hidden for years. His childhood in St. Louis before his mother died and his father headed west. His time as a scout during the latter years of the war, barely more than a boy but trusted with men's lives. The circumstances that had led him to bounty hunting, and the moment he decided to leave that life behind. It was a young man, he told her one evening as they sat side by side near the mine entrance, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. Wanted for robbing a stagecoach. I tracked him for 2 weeks across Nebraska territory. Did you catch him? Prudence asked. Abram nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Found him in a small settlement near the Platte River. He wasn't what I expected, just a kid really, 17 or 18, desperate and scared. When I confronted him, he didn't even draw his weapon. Just looked at me with these resigned eyes, like he'd been waiting for someone like me his whole life. He paused, remembering the moment with painful clarity. I took him in alive. The marshal thanked me, paid me, and I watched them hang him the next morning for stealing $40 and a pocket watch. Prudence's hand found his in the gathering dusk, her fingers warm against his. That's when you quit. That's when I realized I didn't want to be part of that system anymore, he confirmed. I wired my father the same day, asking if he needed help on the ranch. Spent the next 5 years working cattle instead of hunting men. Until he died, she said softly. Until he died, Abram agreed. And his partner decided everything my father had built belonged to him instead of me. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell completely, the stars emerging one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. Prudence hadn't withdrawn her hand from his, and Abram found himself acutely aware of the point where their skin touched a connection both simple and profound. "What will you do?" she asked eventually. "After we get through this, will you still go to California?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Abram turned to look at her, finding her face illuminated by moonlight, her eyes reflecting the starry sky above. "I don't know any more," he admitted. "A week ago I had everything planned. Now—" He trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the change taking place within him. "Now," she prompted. "Now I find myself considering options I never thought possible." He tightened his grip on her hand slightly. "Prudence, when this is over," the distant sound of horses interrupted whatever he might have said. They both tensed, instantly alert to the potential danger. "Inside," Prudence whispered, already rising to her feet. "Quickly." They retreated into the darkness of the mine, extinguishing their small fire and waiting in tense silence as the sounds grew closer. Through the mine entrance, they could see the glow of approaching lanterns, at least 3 or 4 riders by Abram's estimation. "They've found us," Prudence breathed, barely audible even in the silence of the mine. Abram's mind raced, calculating their options. They could try to hide deeper in the mine, but if the searchers were thorough, they'd eventually be discovered. They could fight, but they were outnumbered and likely outgunned. Or they could run, but where? In the darkness, with riders blocking their most obvious escape route. "Listen to me," he said, gripping Prudence's shoulders gently. "Take Belle and go out the back way. There must be another exit from this mine, or at least a ventilation shaft large enough for you to escape through. She shook her head vehemently. Not without you. I'll create a distraction, he insisted. Draw them away from here, give you time to get clear. That's suicide, she hissed. It's a chance for you to live, he countered. I won't let you die because of me, Prudence. I can't. The lanterns were closer now, illuminating the area just outside the mine entrance. They could hear voices, men calling to each other, the occasional laugh or curse. They're going to find us either way, Prudence said, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. If we're going to die, I'd rather face it together than live knowing I abandoned you. Her words struck something deep within Abram, a recognition of the bond that had formed between them in their short time together. It was more than gratitude or circumstance. It was something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, something he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said softly, reaching up to touch her cheek. "You haven't met many women," she retorted, but leaned into his touch nonetheless. The moment hung suspended between them, intimate and fragile despite the danger closing in. Then Prudence straightened, a new determination in her eyes. "I have an idea," she said. "It's risky, but it might work." Before Abram could ask what she meant, she was moving deeper into the mine, returning moments later with an armful of the rusted equipment that had been abandoned years earlier. "There's an old explosives chest back there," she explained hurriedly. "My father told me the miners left in a hurry when the vein played out. They might have left more than just tools." Understanding dawned on Abram's face. "A distraction," he said. "A big one," she confirmed, already sorting through the items she'd gathered. "Help me look." They worked quickly, aware of the voices drawing ever closer to the mine entrance. Finally, Prudence gave a soft cry of triumph as she uncovered a small wooden crate tucked behind a pile of rubble. "Blasting powder," she said, opening it carefully to reveal several cloth-wrapped parcels. "Not much, but enough for what we need." Abram looked at her with newfound appreciation. "You continue to surprise me, Prudence Jamison." "Save your admiration for when we're safely away from here," she replied, though a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Now, here's what we're going to do." Their plan was simple but dangerous. Using the remaining blasting powder, they would create a controlled explosion at the far end of the mine loud enough to draw attention, but not so powerful as to cause a cave-in. In the ensuing confusion, they would slip out with Bell and head south, opposite the direction their pursuers would expect. "Ready?" Abram asked as they positioned themselves near the mine entrance, waiting for the right moment. Prudence nodded, her face resolute in the darkness. "Ready." He struck a match, lighting the fuse they'd carefully measured. Then they retreated to the shadows near the entrance, leading Belle by the reins to keep her calm. The explosion, when it came, was more powerful than they'd anticipated. The ground beneath them shook, dust and small rocks raining down from the ceiling as a thunderous boom echoed through the mine. Outside, they heard shouts of alarm as the men searching for them reacted to the unexpected blast. "Now," Abram urged, and they burst from the mine entrance, taking advantage of the momentary chaos. Several of the searchers had dismounted and were rushing toward the mine, weapons drawn but attention focused on the source of the explosion. In the confusion, Abram and Prudence managed to mount Bell and gallop past them before anyone could react effectively. Shots rang out behind them, but in the darkness, with dust still clouding the air, the bullets went wide. They rode hard, pushing Bell to her limits as they fled south toward the cover of a dense forest that rose on the horizon. "We did it," Prudence called over her shoulder, her voice breathless but triumphant. Abram tightened his arm around her waist, the exhilaration of their escape momentarily overshadowing the pain in his side. "Not yet," he cautioned. "They'll regroup and follow. We need to reach those trees." They rode without stopping until they reached the forest's edge, the first light of dawn beginning to streak the eastern sky. Only when they were deep among the pines did Prudence finally slow Belle to a walk, the exhausted horse grateful for the reprieve. "We should rest her," Prudence said, patting the mare's neck affectionately. "She's given everything she has." They dismounted in a small clearing, Abram wincing as his feet hit the ground. The exertion of their escape had reopened his wound slightly, a fact he tried to hide from Prudence as he helped her unsaddle Belle, but little escaped her notice. "You're bleeding again," she said, gesturing to the dark stain spreading on his shirt. "It's nothing," he dismissed. "Just tore a stitch or two." Prudence's expression made it clear she wasn't accepting his downplaying of the injury. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a fallen log at the clearing's edge. "Now." Too exhausted to argue, Abram complied, watching as she retrieved her medical supplies from the saddlebag. The adrenaline of their escape was fading, leaving behind bone-deep weariness and the throbbing pain of his wound. "You're developing quite the habit of ordering me around," he observed as she knelt beside him, lifting his shirt to examine the damage. "Only when you're being foolish," she replied, her fingers gentle despite her brusque tone, "which seems to be often." Abram chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled at his injury. "Fair point." She worked in silence for a few minutes, cleaning the reopened wound and replacing the torn stitches with practiced efficiency. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more reflective. "You think we lost them?" "For now," Abram said honestly. "But Harrington's not the type to give up easily, especially when there's money involved." Prudence secured the fresh bandage and sat back on her heels, looking up at him with troubled eyes. "Then what's our next move? We can't keep running forever." It was a question Abram had been turning over in his mind since their escape. Running had been necessary for survival, but it wasn't a long-term solution. Sooner or later, they would need to confront the reality of their situation. "We have options," he said slowly. "We could make for the territorial border, try to lose ourselves in Montana or Dakota territory." "Leaving everything behind," Prudence said, not quite a question. "Yes," Abram acknowledged. Or, she prompted when he hesitated. He met her gaze directly, "or we could stop running. Take the fight to Harrington instead." Surprise flickered across her face. "How?" "He has men, money, influence." "He also has enemies," Abram pointed out. "Men like him always do. And I have proof that the ranch was legally mine to sell the deed, my father's will, the bank draft from the sale. All legitimate." "So what are you suggesting?" "That we go to the law." Abram shook his head. "The local sheriff is in Harrington's pocket, but the territorial marshal in Cheyenne isn't. If we could reach him, present our case." "It's a risk," Prudence said, though he could see her considering the possibility. "Harrington would expect us to run, not to seek justice." "Exactly." Abram reached out to take her hand. "Prudence, I can't ask you to take this risk with me. You've already done more than anyone could expect. If you want to return to your homestead, I'll understand." She looked down at their joined hands, then back up to his face. "After everything we've been through, do you really think I would abandon you now?" "I think you deserve a choice," he said softly. "A real one, not made in the heat of danger or out of obligation." Prudence was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady with conviction. "My whole life I've done what was expected of me. I stayed on the homestead after my family died because it was the safe choice, the responsible one. I told myself it was enough." She paused, her eyes never leaving his. "But these past days, running for our lives, I felt more alive than I have in years. Not because of the danger, but because for once, I'm following my heart instead of my head." "And what is your heart telling you?" Abram asked, barely breathing as he waited for her answer. "That some things are worth fighting for," she said simply. "Justice. Truth." She hesitated, then added softly, "You." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Abram felt something shift inside him, a door opening to a future he hadn't dared imagine. "Then we fight," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Together." Their journey to Cheyenne would be dangerous, requiring them to travel through territory Harrington considered his own. But as they made camp that night, planning their route by the light of a small fire, Abram found himself filled with a cautious hope he hadn't felt in years. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time since he could remember, that thought brought peace instead of anxiety. The territorial capital of Cheyenne was a far cry from the small settlements and open ranges Prudence had known all her life. As they rode into town 3 days later, she couldn't help but stare at the bustling streets, the brick buildings standing 2 and 3 stories tall, the constant movement of people and wagons and trains. "It's overwhelming," she admitted to Abram as they made their way toward the center of town. "I've never seen so many people in one place. The railroad changed everything," he explained. "Turned a tent camp into a city almost overnight." They had traveled cautiously, avoiding main roads and settlements where Harrington might have allies. Their journey had been tense but uneventful perhaps, Abram suggested, because Harrington's men were still searching for them in the mountains to the north. Now, as they approached the territorial marshal's office, Prudence felt a mix of hope and trepidation. If the marshal believed their story, they might finally be free of the danger that had brought them together. And then what? The question lingered in her mind, unanswered but impossible to ignore. "Ready?" Abram asked, dismounting and offering his hand to help her down. "As I'll ever be," she replied, accepting his assistance though she scarcely needed it. The marshal's office was a plain but well-maintained building on a side street away from the main thoroughfare. Inside, they found a tidy space with wanted posters lining one wall and a middle-aged clerk sitting behind a desk, sorting through paperwork. "Can I help you folks?" the clerk asked, looking up as they entered. "We need to speak with Marshal Hawkins," Abram said. "It's an urgent matter concerning illegal activities in Sweetwater County." The clerk eyed them skeptically, taking in their trail-worn appearance and the visible exhaustion that days on the run had etched into their features. "The marshal's mighty busy," he hedged. "What sort of illegal activities are we talking about?" "Attempted murder, for one," Abram stated flatly, "along with fraud, intimidation, and abuse of power." That caught the clerk's attention. He studied them more carefully, then nodded toward a closed door at the back of the office. "Wait here," he said, rising from his seat. "I'll see if he's available." As the clerk disappeared into the back room, Prudence found herself holding her breath. This was the moment that would determine whether their gamble paid off or whether they'd risked everything for nothing. Abram's hand found hers, squeezing gently in reassurance. "It will be all right," he murmured, though she could hear the tension in his voice. The door opened again, and the clerk emerged, followed by a tall, broad-shouldered man with steel-gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent in the harsh Wyoming elements. "I'm Marshal James Hawkins," he introduced himself, his keen eyes assessing them both. "I understand you have a serious complaint to file. Step into my office, please." For the next hour, they laid out their case, Abram explaining the circumstances of his father's death, the legitimate sale of the ranch, and Harrington's violent response to what he perceived as a challenge to his authority. Prudence described the ambush she'd witnessed and their subsequent flight through the wilderness, careful to emphasize that Abram had broken no laws in selling property that was rightfully his. Throughout their account, the marshal listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions but offering no indication of whether he believed them. Only when they had finished did he lean back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's quite a story," he said finally. "And not entirely surprising. I've had my eye on Harrington for some time now. There have been rumors, complaints from smaller ranchers being pressured to sell, witnesses suddenly changing their stories in court cases involving his interests." "Then you believe us?" Prudence asked, hope rising in her chest. "I believe you believe what you're telling me," the marshal replied cautiously. "But accusations require evidence, especially against a man with Harrington's connections." Abram reached inside his vest, removing a folded packet of papers he'd kept close to his heart throughout their ordeal. "My father's will," he explained, placing it on the marshal's desk, along with the deed to the ranch bearing his name and the bank draft from its sale. All properly notarized and legally binding. Marshal Hawkins examined the documents carefully, his expression giving nothing away. When he finally looked up, his eyes were sharper, more focused. "This helps," he acknowledged, "but it's still your word against his regarding the ambush." "Without witnesses, I'm a witness," Prudence interrupted. "I saw Harrington's men pursue and shoot Mr. Tanner without provocation or legal authority. With all due respect, madam, your testimony alone may not be enough," the marshal said gently, "especially given your association with Mr. Tanner." The implication wasn't lost on either of them. In the eyes of the law and society, their days alone together had compromised Prudence's credibility, regardless of the circumstances that necessitated it. "There might be others," Abram suggested, refusing to be deterred. "Smaller ranchers who have been intimidated by Harrington, people who have witnessed his methods but been too afraid to speak out." "Possibly," the marshal conceded, "and if I could find such witnesses, build a proper case." He trailed off, studying them both with renewed interest. "What exactly are you asking of me, Mr. Tanner?" "Justice," Abram said simply. "A chance to clear my name and return to my life without looking over my shoulder for Harrington's men." Marshal Hawkins was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded, coming to a decision. "I can't promise anything," he said, "but I've been wanting to investigate Harrington for some time. Your complaint gives me the justification I need to do so officially." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "This won't be quick and it won't be easy. Harrington has friends in high places." "We understand," Abram said, speaking for both of them. "Good." The marshal rose, signaling the end of their meeting. "I'll need your statements in writing, and you'll need to remain in Cheyenne while I begin my investigation. Can you arrange that?" Abram and Prudence exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "We can," Abram confirmed, "though we don't have much in the way of funds for an extended stay." "I may be able to help with that," the marshal said. "I have a small house on the edge of town belonging to my late sister. It's not much, but it's empty and would give you a place to stay out of sight while this plays out." The offer was unexpected and generous. Prudence felt a surge of gratitude toward this man who was willing to take their side against a powerful adversary. "Thank you, Marshal," she said sincerely. "We're in your debt." "Thank me if we succeed," he replied soberly. "For now, let's get those statements recorded." It was late afternoon by the time they completed the necessary paperwork and received directions to the marshal's property. As they rode through Cheyenne's streets toward the small house that would be their temporary sanctuary, Prudence found herself contemplating the strange turn her life had taken. Just days ago, she had been living an isolated routine on her homestead, her future as predictable as the changing seasons. Now she was in a city she'd never visited, partnered with a man she'd known less than a week, embroiled in a dangerous conflict with one of the territory's most powerful ranchers. And yet, despite the danger and uncertainty, she couldn't regret the choices that had led her here. "What are you thinking about?" Abram asked, noticing her pensive expression. "How quickly life can change," she replied honestly. "A week ago I thought I knew exactly what my future held. And now," he prompted. Prudence smiled slightly. "Now I'm beginning to believe that certainty is overrated." The house Marshal Hawkins had offered them was indeed small, a simple two-room structure with basic furnishings, a stone fireplace, and a small garden gone wild from neglect. But after days of sleeping rough in caves and forests, it seemed like luxury to Prudence. "It's not much," Abram said as they settled Belle in the tiny stable at the rear of the property. "But it's safe, at least for now." "It's perfect," Prudence countered, already envisioning how she might bring order to the neglected garden during their stay. "And it's ours for as long as we need it." The word ours hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither was quite ready to address. They had grown close during their days on the run, sharing confidences and building a trust that went beyond mere circumstance. But what that meant for their future if they had one remained unspoken. "I'll see about getting some supplies," Abram said, changing the subject. "The marshal gave me enough money to cover necessities for a few days." Prudence nodded, grateful for the practical focus. "I'll get the house in order." The next few days fell into a pattern as they adjusted to their temporary life in Cheyenne. Abram met daily with Marshal Hawkins, providing additional details about Harrington's operations and helping to identify potential witnesses. Prudence busied herself with the house and garden, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of domestic work after days of constant danger and movement. In the evenings, they would sit together on the small porch, watching the sunset and sharing the events of their day. It was during these quiet moments that Prudence found herself wondering what would happen when this was over, when Harrington was dealt with, and they no longer needed to remain together for safety. The thought of returning to her solitary existence on the homestead, once so familiar and comfortable, now seemed hollow. But what alternative did she have? Abram had spoken of California, of starting fresh somewhere new. Would he still want that when he was free to choose? And more importantly, would he want her to be part of that new beginning? These questions circled in her mind, unanswered as the days passed, and Marshal Hawkins's investigation slowly gathered momentum. According to Abram, the marshal had identified several smaller ranchers who had experienced similar intimidation from Harrington, though convincing them to testify remained challenging. "People are afraid," Abram explained one evening as they sat side by side on the porch swing. "Harrington's reach is long and his memory for grudges even longer." "Will it be enough?" Prudence asked. "The evidence the marshal has gathered." Abram was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful in the fading light. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Hawkins believes he's building a strong case, but these things are never certain, especially when dealing with someone as connected as Harrington." Prudence nodded, understanding the unspoken implications. Even if the marshal succeeded in bringing charges against Harrington, the legal process would be lengthy and uncertain. Their lives would remain in limbo during that time, neither safe to return to their previous existences nor free to move forward. "What will you do?" she asked softly. "If this drags on for months or even years?" Abram turned to look at her, his expression serious. "What will we do, you mean?" The correction was gentle but deliberate, and it sent a flutter of hope through Prudence's heart. "Yes," she agreed. "What will we do?" "I've been thinking about that," he said, reaching for her hand and holding it lightly in his own. "The marshal mentioned that the territorial governor is looking for someone to oversee land claims in the northern counties. Someone honest, with experience in ranching and knowledge of the law." "You?" Prudence asked, surprised. Abram nodded. "Hawkins suggested me for the position. Said my experience as both a rancher and a former bounty hunter gives me a unique perspective. And it would keep me within the territory while the case against Harrington proceeds, but far enough from his influence to be relatively safe." "That sounds like a good opportunity," Prudence said carefully, trying to ignore the disappointment welling in her chest. "A position in the northern counties would take him hundreds of miles away." "When would you start?" "That depends," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "On what you decide." "Me?" Prudence's heart beat faster. "I don't understand." Abram took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "Prudence, these past weeks have been the most dangerous of my life, but they've also been the most honest, the most real. You saved me not just from Harrington's bullets, but from the solitary path I was walking." He shifted on the swing to face her more directly, still holding her hand in his. "I know we've known each other only a short time. I know this isn't how these things are supposed to happen, but I also know that I can't imagine returning to a life where you aren't part of it." Prudence felt tears welling in her eyes, emotion threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "What are you saying, Abram?" she whispered. "I'm saying that I love you," he said simply. "And I'm asking if you would consider a future with me, whether that's in the northern counties or California, or wherever life takes us next." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Prudence felt as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the unknown stretching out before her, terrifying but also exhilarating. "I never expected this," she said finally, her voice unsteady. "When I rode out that day and saw you fighting for your life, I was only thinking of doing what was right. I never imagined that we would find each other," Abram finished when she trailed off. "Yes." She looked up at him, allowing him to see the truth in her eyes. "I love you too, Abram. It happened so quickly, so unexpectedly, but I can't deny it." He raised a hand to cup her cheek, his touch gentle. "Then say you'll come with me. Wherever we go, whatever happens with Harrington and the marshal's case, say we'll face it together." Instead of answering with words, Prudence leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that spoke volumes of trust, of hope, of a future neither had dared imagine just weeks earlier. Abram's arms encircled her, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, a silent promise exchanged between them. When they finally parted, both breathless, Prudence rested her forehead against his. "Yes," she said softly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The next morning brought an unexpected development. They had just finished breakfast when a sharp knock at the door sent them both into immediate alertness, hands instinctively reaching for weapons. "Marshal Hawkins wouldn't knock like that," Abram said quietly, motioning for Prudence to move away from the windows. "And no one else knows we're here." Another knock, more insistent this time. "Tanner, I know you're in there. We need to talk." The voice was unfamiliar, but the tone was commanding rather than threatening. Still, Abram approached the door cautiously, revolver drawn and ready. "Who's asking?" he called through the closed door. "James Fletcher, Deputy Territorial Marshal. Hawkins sent me. It's urgent." Abram glanced at Prudence, who nodded her agreement to open the door. He did so carefully, keeping himself between the visitor and Prudence, his weapon visible but not directly threatening. The man standing on their porch was middle-aged and solidly built, wearing the star of a deputy marshal prominently on his vest. His expression was grave. "May I come in?" he asked, seemingly unfazed by Abram's drawn revolver. "That depends on what's so urgent," Abram replied, not moving from the doorway. "Harrington knows you're in Cheyenne," the deputy said bluntly. "And he knows you're working with Hawkins. There was an incident at the marshal's office this morning." A cold dread settled in Abram's stomach. "What kind of incident? Is Hawkins all right?" Fletcher's expression darkened. "He's alive, but it was close. One of Harrington's men tried to get to the case files, came in shooting. The marshal took a bullet in the shoulder, but he managed to return fire. The assailant didn't make it." Prudence gasped softly behind Abram. "Is the marshal going to recover?" "Doctor says he should with time and proper care," Fletcher confirmed. "But before they took him to the infirmary, he insisted I come warn you. Harrington's desperate now, and desperate men are unpredictable." Abram lowered his weapon slightly, convinced by the deputy's account. "You'd better come in." Once inside, Fletcher explained the situation more fully. The marshal's investigation had been making progress. Several witnesses had agreed to testify against Harrington, and evidence of his illegal activities was mounting. But the attack on the marshal's office had changed the dynamic. Hawkins was planning to present his evidence to the circuit judge next week, Fletcher explained. But now everything's in chaos. The judge is reconsidering whether to hear the case. Witnesses are getting cold feet again, and Harrington's allies are spreading rumors that the whole investigation is a personal vendetta. "What does this mean for us?" Prudence asked, voicing the question foremost in both their minds. Fletcher looked genuinely regretful. "It means you're not safe here anymore. Hawkins wanted me to tell you to consider leaving the territory, at least temporarily. Head to Montana or Colorado until things settle down." "Running again," Abram said, frustration evident in his voice. "While Harrington walks free and expands his power." "I understand your frustration," Fletcher said, "but the marshal's primary concern is your safety, especially now that—" He hesitated, glancing between them. "Now that what?" Prudence prompted. "There's a rumor circulating that Harrington has hired professional gunmen from Colorado to deal with you," the deputy admitted reluctantly. "Men with reputations for finding people who don't want to be found." The news settled heavily in the room, its implications clear. This was no longer just about Abram's inheritance or even justice for past wrongs. It was about survival, pure and simple. "How long do we have?" Abram asked, his mind already calculating their options. "A day, maybe two, before they arrive in town," Fletcher estimated. "I'd recommend you be well clear of Cheyenne by nightfall." The marshal suggested heading north. He has contacts in Montana who might be willing to help shelter you until this blows over. After the deputy left, promising to send word if the situation changed, Abram and Prudence faced each other in the quiet of the small house that had briefly been their sanctuary. "So we run again," Prudence said, a hint of weariness in her voice. "It seems that way," Abram agreed. "Though I'm beginning to think there's no place far enough to truly escape Harrington's reach." Prudence moved to the window, looking out at the small garden she had begun to restore during their brief stay. "What about the position in the northern counties? Could that offer some protection?" Abram shook his head. "It was dependent on the marshal's recommendation, and with Hawkins injured, that's likely on hold." He joined her at the window, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Besides, I'm not sure I want to build a life looking over my shoulder, waiting for Harrington's men to find us." "What other choice do we have?" she asked quietly. Abram was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, there was a new resolve in his voice. "Maybe running isn't the answer. Maybe it's time to end this once and for all." Prudence turned to face him, concern evident in her eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "Harrington wants me," Abram said. "Everything else, the ranch, the money, even the witnesses, those are just details to him now. This has become personal." "Abram," Prudence began, a warning in her tone. "Hear me out," he urged. "What if, instead of running, we use that against him? Set a trap that he can't resist." "A trap," Prudence repeated skeptically. "With what resources? Against professional gunmen." "We have one advantage they don't," Abram pointed out. "We know they're coming. And sometimes the best defense isn't running or hiding, it's choosing the ground where you make your stand." Prudence studied his face, seeing the determination there but also the careful calculation. This wasn't a reckless proposal born of pride or desperation. It was a strategic decision by a man who had spent years tracking others and understood how to turn the tables. "What did you have in mind?" she asked finally. Abram smiled slightly, grateful for her willingness to listen. "First, we need to get word to a few people I trust. Then we need to find the right location somewhere that gives us the advantage." He paused, his expression softening as he took her hands in his. "But Prudence, I need to know, are you with me in this? Because if you'd rather take your chances running, I'll understand. This isn't your fight." Prudence squeezed his hands, her eyes never leaving his. "After everything we've been through, do you really need to ask? Of course I'm with you. Whatever happens next, we face it together." The relief and gratitude in his eyes was answer enough. They spent the rest of the day planning their strategy, sending discreet messages to people Abram trusted from his days as a bounty hunter, gathering supplies, and preparing for what might be their final confrontation with the man who had driven them from their homes. As evening fell, they left the small house that had briefly been their haven, riding north out of Cheyenne as Deputy Fletcher had suggested. But their destination wasn't Montana or the safety of distance. Instead, they headed toward a place Abram knew from his past, an abandoned trading post in a narrow valley where he had once tracked a fugitive years earlier. "It's defensible," he explained as they rode through the gathering darkness. "Limited approaches, good visibility, and strong stone walls that have withstood years of Wyoming winters." "And you're certain Harrington's men will follow us there?" Prudence asked. "With the right bait, yes," Abram confirmed. "The message I sent to Deputy Fletcher ensures they'll know exactly where to find us." "You trust Fletcher that much?" There was no accusation in her question, only caution. "I trust that he's loyal to Marshal Hawkins, and Hawkins is a good man who wants to see justice done," Abram replied. "Besides, we're counting on Harrington finding out where we are. That's the whole point." They rode in companionable silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts about the confrontation to come. It was Prudence who finally spoke, her voice soft in the quiet night. "Abram, if this works, if we survive this and Harrington is finally brought to justice, what happens then?" He glanced over at her, the moonlight illuminating her profile as she rode beside him. "Then we have choices," he said simply. "Real ones, not forced by circumstance or danger." "And what would you choose?" she pressed gently. "If you could have anything." Abram considered the question, not just as a hypothetical but as a real possibility that might soon be within their grasp. "I'd choose a life where I didn't have to look over my shoulder," he said eventually. "A place where we could build something lasting together. Maybe that's California, or maybe it's right here in Wyoming territory. I'm finding that the where matters less than the who." He reached across the space between their horses to take her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "What about you? What would you choose?" Prudence smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes despite the uncertainty of their future. "I'd choose a life where I wake up each morning knowing exactly why I'm fighting to see the next day," she said. With someone who understands that sometimes the most courageous thing isn't facing danger, but facing your own heart. Their gazes held across the darkness, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever came next, whether triumph or tragedy, they would face it as they had faced everything since that first fateful encounter, together, with courage and conviction. The old trading post appeared on the horizon shortly after dawn, a stone structure standing solitary against the vast Wyoming sky. As they approached, Abram studied it with a tactician's eye, noting the defensible positions, the clear lines of sight in all directions, the nearby creek that would provide water during what might be an extended siege. "It's perfect," he declared as they dismounted. "Now we prepare and wait for our guests to arrive." The preparation was methodical, drawing on skills both had honed through years of frontier living. They secured Belle in the remains of a stable at the rear of the building, gathered firewood and filled water barrels from the creek, and checked and rechecked their limited arsenal: Abram's revolver, Prudence's rifle, and a shotgun they'd purchased in Cheyenne before departing. By midday, there was nothing left to do but wait. They took turns watching the approaches to the trading post, alert for any sign of Harrington's hired guns. "How many do you think he sent?" Prudence asked as they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. "Based on what Fletcher said, probably 3 or 4, Abram estimated. Professional gunmen work in small groups, easier to travel unnoticed and split the reward." Prudence nodded, absorbing this information with the same practical acceptance she'd shown throughout their ordeal. "And your friends? Will they come in time?" "If they got my messages, yes," Abram said. "Though I'm counting more on Harrington's impatience than on reinforcements. Men like him aren't used to waiting for what they want." As the afternoon wore on with no sign of approaching riders, Prudence found herself growing increasingly tense. The waiting was almost worse than the danger itself, the constant anticipation of violence, the strain of remaining vigilant hour after hour. Abram seemed to sense her unease. He came to stand beside her at the window where she kept watch, his presence solid and reassuring. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "No," she said firmly. "Just wishing it were over one way or another," he nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. "It will be soon enough." He paused, studying her profile in the fading light. "Prudence, there's something I need to say in case—" "Don't," she interrupted, turning to face him. "Don't speak as if we might not survive this." "Not for lack of confidence," he assured her with a small smile. "But because some things shouldn't remain unsaid, regardless of what happens next." He took her hands in his expression solemn. "You saved me in ways I'm still discovering. Whatever the future holds, know that meeting you changed everything for me." Prudence felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. This was not a moment for sorrow or fear, but for truth. "And you showed me that safety isn't always found in staying still," she replied. "That sometimes you have to risk everything to find what truly matters." The moment stretched between them, intimate and profound despite the danger that surrounded them. Slowly, deliberately, Abram leaned forward and kissed her, not with the desperate passion of their previous embraces, but with a gentle reverence that spoke of promises and possibilities. When they parted, both wore expressions of quiet determination. Whatever came next, they had this moment, this truth between them that couldn't be taken away by Harrington or his men. The sound of approaching horses reached them just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley. Prudence tensed, her hand automatically reaching for the rifle leaning against the wall. "How many?" she whispered, moving away from the window to avoid being silhouetted against the fading light. Abram peered carefully through a crack in the shutters. 4 riders, he confirmed. Coming from the east, taking their time. They know we're here, Prudence said, not a question but a statement. Yes, Abram agreed, but they don't know we're expecting them. He turned to her, his expression serious. Remember the plan. Stay out of sight, cover the rear entrance. I'll handle the front. Prudence nodded, though every instinct rebelled against the idea of separating, even by the width of the small building. Be careful, she said simply. Always, he promised, then moved to take position near the front door, revolver drawn and ready. The riders approached cautiously, stopping about 50 yards from the trading post. In the gathering dusk, they were little more than silhouettes, 4 men on horseback, the shape of rifles visible against the darkening sky. Tanner, one of them called out. We know you're in there. Come out and face us like a man. Abram remained silent, watching through the partially shuttered window as the men conferred among themselves. Finally, one dismounted and began approaching the building, rifle held ready. Last chance, Tanner, the man shouted. Come out now or we start shooting. The woman too, if she's in there with you. Still, Abram made no response. The strategy was simple: force them to commit, to approach the building where he and Prudence would have the advantage of cover and prepared positions. The first shot came moments later, shattering the window to Abram's left. He ducked instinctively as glass rained down around him, then raised his head cautiously to assess the situation. The gunman, who had approached on foot, was now taking cover behind a large rock about 30 yards from the trading post. The others remained on horseback, spreading out to surround the building. Prudence, Abram called softly. They're trying to flank us. 2 riders heading around back. I see them, she replied from her position at the rear window, her voice steady despite the danger. I'm ready. The next minutes passed in a blur of gunfire and shouted threats, as Harrington's men attempted to force their way into the trading post. Abram and Prudence held their positions, firing only when they had clear shots, conserving their limited ammunition. One of the mounted gunmen fell with a cry of pain as Prudence's rifle found its mark, sending the others scrambling for better cover. The man Abram had wounded earlier was still behind the rock, occasionally firing in the direction of the front door but clearly reluctant to risk exposing himself to another shot. They're pulling back, Prudence reported, her voice tight with tension. Regrouping behind that ridge to the east. They'll try again, Abram predicted, quickly reloading his revolver. Probably wait until full dark, hoping to catch us off guard. He was right. As night fell completely over the valley, the gunfire ceased, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the occasional call of a night bird or rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation. What are they waiting for? Prudence whispered after nearly an hour had passed without incident. Abram had just opened his mouth to respond when the answer came in the form of a flaming arrow arcing through the darkness to land on the trading post's wooden roof. They're trying to burn us out, he realized aloud, already moving toward the ladder that led to the building's small loft. Keep watch while I deal with this. More flaming arrows followed the first, some finding their mark on the roof, others falling harmlessly to the ground outside. Abram worked frantically to extinguish the flames that had caught hold, using water from one of the barrels they'd filled earlier. Below, Prudence divided her attention between watching for approaching gunmen and tracking Abram's progress on the roof. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Smoke was beginning to fill the trading post, and their water supplies were limited. Abram, she called urgently. Someone's approaching from the west. Using the smoke as cover, he scrambled down from the loft, his face blackened with soot but his eyes alert. How many? At least 2, maybe more, she replied, raising her rifle. Too much smoke to be certain. They positioned themselves on either side of the main room, weapons ready as footsteps approached the front entrance. The door burst open with a crash, and two men rushed in, guns blazing. Abram fired twice in quick succession, dropping the first intruder before he'd taken 3 steps. Prudence's rifle cracked almost simultaneously, the second man falling backward with a cry of pain. But the victory was short-lived. More footsteps approached from the rear of the building, and Prudence turned just in time to see a third gunman entering through the back door she'd thought was secured. "Abram!" she shouted in warning, but the smoke and confusion made it impossible to get a clear shot. Time seemed to slow as the gunman raised his weapon, aiming directly at Abram's exposed back. Without conscious thought, Prudence threw herself forward, knocking Abram aside as the shot rang out. She felt a searing pain across her upper arm, but ignored it, raising her rifle and firing in one fluid motion. The gunman staggered backward, his own weapon falling from lifeless fingers as he collapsed in the doorway. "Prudence!" Abram was at her side instantly, his face pale with concern as he saw the blood staining her sleeve. "You're hit." "It's just a graze," she assured him, though the pain was intensifying. "We need to secure the doors before more come." Working together, they dragged heavy furniture to barricade both entrances, then checked the fallen gunmen to confirm they posed no further threat. 2 were dead, the third unconscious but likely to survive with proper medical attention. The immediate danger past, Abram turned his full attention to Prudence's injury, gently helping her remove her jacket to examine the wound. "You're right," he said with relief after cleaning away the blood. "Just a graze, but it needs bandaging." He worked quickly, tearing strips from his own shirt to create a makeshift bandage. "Why did you do that? Put yourself at risk for me." Prudence met his gaze steadily. "The same reason you've been protecting me since we met, because some things are worth the risk." Their eyes held for a long moment, understanding passing between them without need for words. Then Abram leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "We're not out of this yet," he reminded her softly. "There's at least one more out there." "Let him come," Prudence said with unexpected fierceness. "We've faced worse together." As if in response to her declaration, the sound of multiple horses approaching reached them through the smoke and darkness. Abram tensed, reaching for his revolver despite knowing they were badly outnumbered if Harrington had sent reinforcements. "Tanner," a voice called from outside. "It's Fletcher, Deputy Marshal, hold your fire." Relief washed over both their faces as they recognized the voice of the deputy who had warned them in Cheyenne. "Fletcher," Abram called back cautiously. "How do we know it's really you?" "Marshal Hawkins sent me," came the reply. "Said to tell you he's sorry he missed the party, but his shoulder's giving him some trouble." Abram smiled at the confirmation that only the real Fletcher could provide. "We're coming out," he shouted, then turned to Prudence. "Ready." She nodded, straightening her shoulders despite the pain in her arm. Together, they emerged from the smoking trading post to find not just Fletcher but a half-dozen armed men, a posse assembled to apprehend Harrington's gunmen. In the chaos and smoke, it took a moment for Abram to recognize 2 of the faces among the group. "Martinez." "Blackwood," he called in disbelief. "How did you got your message?" the first man explained, dismounting to approach them. "Figured you could use some backup, old friend." "Former bounty hunters," Abram explained to Prudence. "Some of the best in the business." The reunions and explanations were brief, as the situation remained dangerous. The 4th gunman had fled when the posse arrived, likely heading back to report to Harrington. "We need to move quickly," Fletcher advised. "Get you both somewhere safe until we can sort this mess out." "No," Abram said firmly, surprising everyone. "No more running, no more hiding. It's time Harrington faced what he's done." Fletcher looked skeptical. "You're suggesting we confront him directly. That's risky, Tanner. He still has allies' influence." "He also has enemies," Abram pointed out. "And now he's lost his hired guns. There will never be a better time to end this." The deputy considered this, glancing at the other members of the posse. "What did you have in mind?" "A trap," Abram said simply. "Using the one thing Harrington wants more than anything." "You," Prudence realized aloud. Abram nodded. "Me and my father's money." The plan they developed was bold but straightforward. With Fletcher's agreement, they would send word to Harrington that Abram was willing to surrender the bank draft from the ranch sale in exchange for being allowed to leave the territory unmolested. The exchange would take place in the main street of Sweetwater Creek, Harrington's own territory, but also a public place where witnesses would be present. "He won't be able to resist," Abram predicted. "The chance to humiliate me publicly, to show everyone that he's won. His pride will demand it." "And when he shows up," Fletcher asked. "You and your men will be waiting," Abram explained. "Along with anyone else who's willing to stand against him. It's time the people of Sweetwater Creek saw that Harrington isn't untouchable." The preparations took 2 days, sending messages, gathering allies, positioning men strategically throughout the small town. When the appointed time came, Abram stood alone in the center of Sweetwater Creek's main street, the bank draft visible in his hand as he waited for Harrington to appear. Prudence watched from the window of the general store, her heart in her throat despite knowing that Fletcher's men were positioned in buildings on both sides of the street. Her arm still ached from the bullet graze, but she held her rifle steady, ready to provide covering fire if necessary. Harrington arrived precisely on time, accompanied by 3 men who were clearly there for protection rather than negotiation. He was older than Prudence had expected, in his 50s, with iron gray hair and the well-fed look of a man accustomed to wealth and power. "Tanner," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet street. "I see you finally came to your senses." Abram stood his ground, the bank draft still visible in his hand. "I came to end this, Harrington, one way or another." "There's only one way this ends, boy," Harrington replied, his tone dismissive. "With you giving me what's rightfully mine and then disappearing from my territory for good." "Rightfully yours," Abram repeated. "The ranch belonged to my father. He left it to me legally. The sale was legitimate." "Your father built that ranch on my land with my backing," Harrington countered, his voice hardening. "Everything he had, he owed to me." "That's not how he told it," Abram said calmly, "but I'm not here to argue history. I'm here to offer you a choice. Take the money and let me go in peace, or face the consequences of your actions." Harrington laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Consequences? In my town? Look around you, Tanner. There are no consequences for me here. Are you sure about that?" Abram asked, and at his words, doors and windows opened all along the street. Fletcher emerged from the saloon, badge gleaming in the sunlight. Martinez and Blackwood stepped out from the livery stable, rifles ready. And from other buildings came faces Prudence didn't recognize: townspeople, ranchers, ordinary citizens who had lived too long under Harrington's shadow. "What is this?" Harrington demanded, his confidence visibly shaken for the first time. "Justice," Abram said simply. "Something long overdue in Sweetwater Creek." Fletcher stepped forward, his expression grim. "George Harrington, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, intimidation, and fraud. You have the right to come peacefully or face the consequences." For a moment, it seemed Harrington might surrender. Then, with a speed belying his age, he reached for the revolver at his hip. "No." Prudence cried, raising her rifle just as multiple shots rang out across the street. When the smoke cleared, Harrington lay motionless in the dust, his final defiance ending the only way it could against such overwhelming odds. His men, seeing the hopelessness of their position, wisely raised their hands in surrender. In the aftermath, as Fletcher and his deputies took control of the situation, Abram searched the crowd until he found Prudence emerging from the general store, her rifle still clutched in her hands. He crossed to her quickly, relief evident in every line of his body. "It's over," he said simply, drawing her into a gentle embrace mindful of her injured arm. "Truly over." Prudence leaned into him, the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to ebb. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Abram pulled back slightly to look into her eyes, his own filled with a certainty that hadn't been there before. "Now," he said, "we get to choose our own path without fear or shadow." "Together?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Together," he confirmed, "if that's what you want." Instead of answering with words, Prudence stood on tiptoe and kissed him there in the middle of Sweetwater Creek's Main Street, with half the town watching. It was a declaration more powerful than any speech, a choice made freely, and with full knowledge of all it entailed. When they parted, both were smiling despite the gravity of the situation around them. In that moment, surrounded by the aftermath of violence yet facing a future filled with possibility, they found the peace that had eluded them both for so long. "You should have let me go that first day," Abram said softly, stroking her cheek with gentle fingers. "It would have been safer for you." Prudence shook her head, her eyes never leaving his. "And spend the rest of my life wondering," she countered. "No. Some questions need answers, no matter the risk." The answer, it seemed, had been there all along in the courage to reach out when isolation seemed safer, in the strength to stand firm when running seemed wiser, in the faith to trust when experience counseled doubt. As they walked together through the town that had witnessed the end of one chapter in their lives and the beginning of another, neither knew exactly what the future held. But they knew they would face it, as they had faced everything since that fateful day when a wounded cowboy and a brave homesteader's paths crossed together, with open hearts and the certainty that love, once found, was worth any risk and every sacrifice. In the years that followed, Sweetwater Creek would remember the day George Harrington fell as the beginning of a new era. Under Abram's leadership, as the newly appointed territorial land agent, long-standing disputes were resolved fairly, smaller ranchers flourished, and the community began to heal from years of intimidation and fear. Prudence found her calling as well, establishing a small infirmary where she could use the medical skills her father had taught her to serve the growing population. Their wedding, celebrated 6 months after Harrington's fall, became an occasion for the entire community to come together in celebration of not just their union, but the new beginning it represented for everyone. The homestead that had once seemed a lonely prison to Prudence became the heart of their life together, expanded with Abram's careful craftsmanship, filled with the laughter of the children who eventually blessed their union, and always open to travelers and neighbors in need of assistance or simply good company. On quiet evenings, they would often sit together on the porch Abram had built, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in colors no artist could capture. Sometimes they spoke of the past, of the desperate days when they had run for their lives, of the moment when a single bullet might have altered everything, of the choices that had led them to each other against all odds. More often, though, they spoke of the present and the future of their children's latest adventures, of plans for the coming seasons, of the community they were helping to build together. The dangers they had faced faded into memory, important for the strength they had forged but no longer defining their days. Only occasionally, when the wind carried a certain chill, or when a stranger's face momentarily revived old vigilance, would Abram find himself remembering the moment when he had lain bleeding in the dirt, certain his life was ending rather than truly beginning. "What are you thinking about?" Prudence would ask, always attuned to the subtle shifts in his mood even after years together. And Abram would smile, taking her hand in his as he had done countless times since that first tentative touch in a hidden cave, finding in the familiar warmth all the answer he needed. "I'm thinking that some bullets miss their mark for a reason," he would reply. "And some rescues save more than just a life." Prudence would lean against him then, content in the knowledge that their story begun in danger and desperation had found its way to peace and purpose. Not because fate had decreed it, but because when faced with the choice between safety and possibility, they had both chosen the harder, braver path, and neither had ever found reason to regret it.